It was the morning after Christmas. Inside a quiet home in Boulder, Colorado, a 6-year-old girl was supposed to be waking up to the excitement of Christmas presents. Instead, her mother found a ransom note demanding $118,000 for her daughter's safe return. Police were called. The house was searched. But then investigators discovered something that changed the case forever. The little girl had never been kidnapped. Her body was inside the family home. And almost 3 decades later, one question still haunts this case. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey, and why has the truth remained hidden for so long? December 26, 1996. It was the morning after Christmas in Boulder, Colorado. Inside the Ramsey family home, everything appeared normal at first. But sometime during the night, 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey had disappeared. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, said she discovered a handwritten ransom note on the staircase. The note claimed that JonBenét had been kidnapped and demanded exactly $118,000 for her safe return. It was an unusual amount. And there was something even stranger about the note. It was remarkably long for a ransom message. Patsy immediately called 911. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the Ramsey home and began searching for evidence of a kidnapping. Everyone was looking for signs that someone had broken into the house. But there was no obvious scene of a forced abduction. And as the investigation unfolded that morning, the police would make a discovery that would turn the case into one of America's most infamous mysteries. JonBenét wasn't missing. She was still inside the house. The search inside the Ramsey home continued. At first, investigators were treating the situation as a kidnapping. But then, one of the officers went down to the basement. There, inside a small room, police discovered JonBenét. She was found dead inside her own home. The kidnapping theory immediately began to unravel. There was no missing child to search for. There was now a homicide investigation. And suddenly, the Ramsey house itself became the center of the investigation. Detectives had to work out what had happened during the hours between Christmas night and the morning of December 26. Who had entered the house? How had JonBenét died? And most importantly, was the killer actually a stranger who had broken into the home? Or had someone inside the house known more than they were saying? Those questions would divide investigators, the media, and the public for decades. But there was another piece of evidence that made this case even more complicated. The ransom note. The ransom note became one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the entire case. It was more than 2 pages long. And it demanded exactly $118,000 for JonBenét's safe return. That number immediately caught investigators' attention because it was almost identical to the amount of money John Ramsey had recently received as a bonus from his company. The note also contained instructions for the family. It warned them not to contact the police or anyone else. But they had already called the police. And there was another detail that made investigators question the kidnapping story. The note appeared to have been written inside the Ramsey home. Investigators examined the handwriting, the wording, and the paper itself, searching for clues about who could have written it. But the ransom note didn't provide a simple answer. Instead, it created even more questions. If an outsider had kidnapped JonBenét, why would they spend so much time writing a lengthy ransom note inside the house? And if someone inside the house had written it, what were they trying to hide? The ransom note would remain one of the biggest mysteries in the case. As investigators began examining the Ramsey home more closely, their attention increasingly turned toward the people who lived there. John and Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's parents, were questioned about what happened that night. At the same time, investigators also considered the possibility that an intruder had entered the home. The case quickly became surrounded by competing theories. Some investigators questioned whether the crime could have been committed by someone from outside the family. Others focused on details inside the house and wondered whether someone who knew the family might have been responsible. But there was a major problem. There was no immediate piece of evidence that conclusively identified the killer. The investigation became a complicated puzzle involving the ransom note, the condition of the house, forensic evidence, and conflicting interpretations of what happened that night. And as the media began covering the case, the Ramsey family found themselves at the center of intense public suspicion. But suspicion is not proof. And years later, no member of the Ramsey family has been convicted of JonBenét's murder. The case was far from over. In fact, some of its most important questions were still waiting to be answered. One of the biggest questions in the JonBenét Ramsey case was whether someone from outside the family had entered the house that night. Investigators examined the possibility of an intruder. There were details at the Ramsey home that fueled questions about whether an outside person could have gotten inside. But proving an intruder theory was another matter. Investigators had to determine whether there was reliable evidence that an unknown person had actually entered the house and committed the crime. At the same time, the family continued to face intense scrutiny. The media focused heavily on the parents, while other investigators and observers continued to consider the possibility that someone outside the family was responsible. For years, these competing theories remained at the center of the case. And then there was another crucial piece of evidence: DNA. Forensic testing would eventually become one of the most important parts of the investigation, and it would raise questions that investigators are still trying to answer today. The case took another complicated turn when investigators began examining DNA evidence. Testing identified genetic material associated with an unknown male profile and evidence connected to JonBenét. That finding became especially important because the DNA did not immediately point investigators toward a known member of the Ramsey family. For some, it strengthened the possibility that an unknown person could have been involved. But DNA evidence in this case has never provided a simple answer. Over the years, investigators continued to examine what the DNA actually represented, how it got there, and whether it belonged to the person responsible for JonBenét's death. Meanwhile, advances in forensic technology offered new possibilities. As DNA testing became more sophisticated, investigators hoped that evidence collected decades earlier might eventually reveal a name. But there was still one enormous problem. There was no confirmed suspect who could be definitively connected to the crime. And as the years passed, the question remained: could modern DNA technology finally solve a murder that had remained unsolved for decades? Years passed, but the questions surrounding JonBenét's death refused to disappear. The investigation generated thousands of leads, interviews, and tips. People came forward claiming to know something about the case. Others suggested completely different explanations for what happened inside the Ramsey home that night. But despite all the theories, investigators never reached a point where they could prove exactly who killed JonBenét. The case also became one of the most heavily scrutinized investigations in America. Every detail was examined again and again: the ransom note, the evidence inside the house, the forensic findings, and the statements made by people connected to the case. And while public opinion often shifted from one theory to another, the central question remained unchanged. Who was responsible for the death of a 6-year-old girl? For the Ramsey family, the case became a decades-long nightmare. For investigators, it became a cold case that refused to stay buried. And for the public, JonBenét Ramsey's name became permanently connected to one of America's most mysterious unsolved murders. But the JonBenét Ramsey investigation never truly ended. Boulder police have continued to review the case, follow new leads, conduct interviews, and re-examine evidence. In recent years, investigators have also brought in outside experts to look at the case with fresh eyes. And DNA remains an important part of that effort. The department has said that advances in forensic science could potentially provide new information from evidence collected decades ago. But there is an important distinction. Despite years of investigation, no one has been convicted of JonBenét's murder. And authorities have not publicly confirmed that a specific person is responsible. In fact, Boulder police continue to describe the investigation as an active, ongoing homicide case. Decades later, detectives are still looking for the same thing they were searching for on that December morning in 1996. Evidence that can finally tell them who killed JonBenét Ramsey. Because after all these years, the case still has no final answer. Only questions. And perhaps the most haunting question of all: if the evidence is still out there, Will modern science finally be able to reveal the person who left it behind? After decades of investigation, the JonBenét Ramsey case still leaves behind a disturbing list of unanswered questions. Who wrote the ransom note? Why was such a specific amount of money demanded? How did JonBenét die inside her own home? Was an intruder responsible? Or did the answer lie somewhere much closer to home? And perhaps most importantly, why has no one ever been convicted for her murder? The case has produced countless theories, but theories are not the same as facts. Some details have been interpreted in completely different ways by investigators, experts, and the public. And that is exactly what makes this case so difficult. Every possible explanation seems to raise another question. For JonBenét's family, Christmas morning 1996 became the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades. For investigators, it became a case that refused to be solved. And for the world, it became a mystery that still demands one final answer. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey? But perhaps the most disturbing part of the JonBenét Ramsey case is not what we know. It is what we still don't know. A 6-year-old girl went to sleep on Christmas night. By the next morning, she was dead inside her own home. A ransom note suggested kidnapping. The investigation uncovered a homicide. Years of theories followed. The evidence was examined, questioned, and re-examined. And decades later, the case remains without a criminal conviction. For the people who have followed this case, one question continues to stand above everything else. Who was responsible for JonBenét's death? Until investigators can answer that question with evidence strong enough to prove it, the mystery remains. Because sometimes, the hardest cases aren't the ones where there are no clues. They're the ones where there are too many clues, and none of them gives you the complete answer. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. And her murder remains unsolved. If you believe this case can still be solved, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happened to JonBenét Ramsey? Was the answer inside the Ramsey home? Or was the killer someone who was never identified? Decades later, those questions remain unanswered. And until the evidence finally tells us the truth, the JonBenét Ramsey case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved murders. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the truth isn't hidden because there are no clues. Sometimes, it's hidden because we still haven't found the right way to put those clues together.